Welcome to the Golf Improvement Podcast, episode 21.
Welcome to the podcast for golf lovers and enthusiasts who are looking to take their games to new heights. Dedicated to custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice to improve your golf game. This is the Golf Improvement Podcast with your host, Tony Wright.
Hello, this is Tony Wright from Game Improvement Golf in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with the Golf Improvement Podcast, dedicated to bringing you useful information on custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice techniques to take your game to new heights. Well, you probably realize, if you look at my blog, that I had a great time at the PGA show this year. I think it was the largest of the shows I've attended, and it was certainly larger than the one last year. I enjoyed getting to meet some new friends at the show, actually a couple of folks that I had corresponded with in the past. Maria Palazzola, who has a wonderful website called My Golf Instructor, and George Connor from Connor Golf, who's a putting expert who did a recent podcast interview with me. I also had a great pleasure to meet and learn from Ben Pellicani from Pelly Golf, who taught a putting instruction class sponsored by Seymour Putters at the Mike Bender Academy on the Saturday after the show. And then, of course, right after that, I got sick, and I've been in bed for almost a week, but I'm almost better. I hope my voice isn't too weird in terms of how it projects in this podcast. One of the things that really kind of fascinated me at the show happened when I attended the Flight Scope certification class. Actually, it was on the day of the demo day. One of the speakers at the class was a club fitting expert named Michael Neff. He talked about his use of the Flight Scope, but he also talked about working with a couple of well-known names from the PGA Tour who he has worked with in terms of helping them improving their driving through a little bit better driver fitting. And he mentioned and talked about the fact that he believes that the drivers they were playing had lie angles that were too upright. They were probably too long, but the lie angles were upright, and when he made some modifications to their drivers, I think largely making it a little shorter to make the lie angles effectively a little flatter, they started, well, he did some other things too, but I think he made the shafts a lot heavier than they were in the past for these players. But they started getting a lot better driving results. Now, at one level, you say, well, really, because lie angle is not expected to be a huge impact in terms of driving performance because driver lofts are so low. But I did talk with Tom Washon about that, and he mentioned to me that driver lie angles have increased from about 55 degrees in the 1980s to about 60 degrees now, and that's kind of interesting to me, and the question is why, and I'm not sure anybody knows particularly why. At the same time, driver lengths have probably increased maybe at least 2 inches, at least the OEM drivers, and that's not consistent with playing with an increased lie angle. Now, again, this change in and of itself may not be of major importance for golfers, although if someone is really towing up their driver a lot at address, it might have some impact on their driving performance. But anyhow, regardless of whether or not it has a big impact, I'm going to do a little testing and try to collect some data for myself. So I'm going to run an experiment in February, and those of you listening who are close by, I hope you can give me some help in doing this experiment. I'm going to measure golfers' driver lie angles. I'm going to measure the lie angle, the actual static lie angle of the driver, driver length, driver swing weight, record the shaft and the flex in the head, a bunch of things, record their handicaps. And I'm also going to measure the effective lie angle for their driver at impact. And so I'm going to hopefully collect 50 to 100 data points, maybe more, and see what it tells me. Don't know what it's going to tell me. I'm not even going to presume what it's going to tell me. I'm going to see what happens. So I'm going to particularly focus on this on Saturdays at the Centennial Golf Course at the Centennial Academy where I do my fittings. And I'll be doing testing, be there specifically from noon to about 3 p.m. every day in February on Saturdays. If you're listening to the podcast and you're around and you're interested, get in touch with me. and I'd love to have you participate. I will get full results of these tests back to everybody who participates in them. So there you go, and we will see what happens. Now, I hope you enjoy. This is the first time I've done a three-way podcast, and it was very interesting. I hope you enjoy it. I'm kind of calling it talking about the modern science of learning and how it applies to golf improvement. Hello, this is Tony Wright with the Golf Improvement Podcast, and today it's a real pleasure to do something a little different. We're doing a three-way podcast, and I'm going to say we're talking about the modern science of learning and how golfers can get value from this knowledge. We have two folks with us today, Dr. Robert Bjork, who's a distinguished research professor in the Department of Psychology at UCLA, and his research focuses on human learning and memory, and he directs the Bjork Learning and Forgetting Lab at UCLA. And our second guest is Dr. Mark McDaniel, who's a professor of psychology and the director of the Center for Integrative Research on Cognition, Learning, and Education at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And Mark is also one of the authors of a recent book that I read that I think is excellent called Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. So guys, welcome today.
Glad to be here.
Thank you, Tony.
And, we'll kind of wing this. Every once in a while, we'll probably talk over each other with three people, but I'm sure we'll get this all worked out well. Well, let's start out a little bit. Robert, you first, and then Mark, talk a little bit about your stories from the standpoint of getting interested in maybe golf some. I know Robert's done a little bit more of that than Mark has, but also interested in learning about learning.
Well, in my case, the golf history is a long one since I caddied during the summers in Minnesota as I think starting about age 12. Then went to the University of Minnesota on an Evans caddy scholarship, which was very important at that time for financial reasons. And then I've continued to play all the intervening decades. As far as an interest in learning, I was thinking back on that, and I think some, key events happened actually when I was a graduate student at Stanford, where I then first kind of realized, without going into details, that there were certain really important peculiarities of how people learned that people also didn't really understand.
Yeah.
And that's fascinated me ever since, namely, why wouldn't we, just based on kind of all the experiences we have in formal and informal education, why wouldn't we come to understand how it works? But in all manner of ways, we have misperceptions, our intuitions mislead us, and that's true in terms of working on our golf game as well as trying to learn things in classes and so on. So I'd say that fascination has never stopped ever since that time in terms of just trying to understand how it works and why people don't understand how it works.
Well, thanks for that. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you for a second then.
Well, Tony, I really got interested in learning and memory as a college student in my first course on biological psychology, and was really intrigued with the work that was going on at the time on the mechanisms of memory and how the neurons and brain supports memory. And then when I got to grad school, I was still interested in that, but at the time there was a bit of a revolution in human memory theory. The original view had been that for long-term memory, the important thing that we could do was to continually repeat.
Yeah.
It's known as the total time hypothesis. And at the time I was in grad school, that total time hypothesis was being disproven with research, and in its place was a new view that talked about memory and long-term retention being a function of how we thought about information, not how much, but how we thought about information. And that fundamental principle is really seminal point of make it stick, which is it's how we approach learning that's so important, and not how much effort necessarily we're putting into it. And so that really fascinated me, and that was one of my first research projects was exactly on that theme, and it's been that way ever since.
Well, I think the whole area of this is so exciting because I think there's so much that, beside, obviously I'm interested in golfers, but in the whole area of learning that I think things can really expand if more and more people understand some of the new knowledge that folks like you are, and not necessarily new knowledge, but great knowledge that you folks are engaged in. Both of you talk about a concept, I like the words desirable difficulties, and I can see that how that can relate to golfers and how they practice. Can you talk about this concept, each a little bit, in the context of learning golf skills?
Well, I guess if you want me to start again first, it's a term I coined actually a little over 20 years ago. And what it refers to is there's a number of conditions of learning that make people improve very rapidly, but then those same conditions fail to support performance when it matters, at a delay, in a new context. Whereas on the other side of things, there are conditions of learning. These include things like varying the conditions of learning, interleaving the separate tasks to be learned, using testing people rather than showing them something. And these things create challenges and difficulties, appear to be slowing the rate of learning, but then they often enhance long-term retention and transfer. It's extremely relevant to golf and how you practice golf. And so it's very, very relevant also, of course, to things like how we study and how we try to learn. And so it's a kind of broad concept. And one thing Mark can speak to, it's the sort of empirical pattern that you see one thing during the practice or training and then see another at a delay. That's very clear and very important. Exactly the processes that underlie that get kind of tricky to sketch in detail.
Yeah.
But I should let Mark pitch in.
Well, Bob, that was a great foundation, and applying these notions of interleaving particular kinds of training tasks and varying the learning context. The direct applications to golf are things like when you're practicing, I think it's sometimes usual for a golfer to practice one iron over and over again, perhaps.
Yeah.
And the concept of desirable difficulty, and that feels good because as you keep hitting that iron, seems like you're getting better and better, and finally you say, good, I know how to hit this iron. Problem is then when you get on the golf course later, it may not be that those motor skills are retained as well as you might like. And the concept of desirable difficulty would be to say, well, you can make things a little bit more challenging by interleaving practice with the iron. So the idea would be practice the 9-iron for a couple shots, then move to the 7, then move to the 5, even vary it up, 9 to 4, back up to 7. And the idea there is you're not going to have the sense of mastery, but that's counter to what's happening. What's happening is you're refining, using that iron after different shots, refining the skills that are necessary to know exactly how to hit that iron when your previous shot has been with another iron or another club. And the idea is that should create better transfer to the golf course and better retention of that skill. Even though it feels like the skill is not accruing rapidly, what you do learn is fairly permanent. And I might add, I might add that, Tony, that these kinds of things apply to other sports as well. So I was a couple years ago talking to a professional ice hockey assistant coach, and it turns out that many of their practices mask a particular drill, and I suggested, well, you ought to interleave these drills for better success and retention. It turns out the teams that this guy has worked for have been Stanley Cup winners the past couple of years. I don't know if he's applied what we talked about, but the suggestion is that these can improve performance significantly for all players.
Yes, that's an important point. And in fact, right now we're working with a soccer coach in Great Britain on practice conditions. But really, it's if you go to a driving range and watch people, it's not too strong a statement to say they typically are doing everything wrong as far as practicing. Mark has pointed out one thing, which is perhaps the most dramatic thing. They just keep beating the ball with the same club. But a whole bunch of things, they hit, they don't really aim at a target necessarily. They line themselves up with the lines on the mat. There won't be lines out on the golf course. You won't be able to hit the second shot with the same club a few seconds later. And so the interleaving is important. Also related to that is variation. So for example, there's work now showing that if you want to get good at hitting, let's say a wedge shot 80 yards, you are better off of practicing a random mixture of 80 and 100 yard shots, never the 90 yard shot, than you are hitting a zillion of 90 yard shots. So one thing that really misleads people in all of these sports is a kind of very wrong idea, which is the muscle memory idea.
Oh, gee, yeah, I hate that idea.
That's that somehow if I just repeat, it'll get encoded in my muscles. And from both a behavioral and brain standpoint, nothing could be wronger than that. A good illustration is from my colleague at UCLA, Richard Schmidt, very prominent in motor skills, who points out that if you write your signature on a sheet of paper in the normal way, and then you go into some classroom on a big blackboard and you write it in letters 2 feet tall, those signatures will overlap each other almost perfectly, but there's no overlap in the muscles involved. So when you write it 2 feet tall on a blackboard, you have to immobilize the muscles in your fingers that you would normally use with your signature. So there's no overlap of the muscles, and the signature looks identical.
That's a fascinating way to portray that. Almost any time I see anything that says improve your muscle memory, I start going, oh, yeah.
It really is a notion that leads to, in all sports, but maybe golf more than anything else, really leads to people to mismanage their practice conditions.
Yeah. Well, another thing I asked you folks to think about is, and I was wondering about this term, instant amnesia. And can you talk about where it does and doesn't apply in terms of learning golf skills? I mean, should there be times when we're kind of forgetting what we've done, or?
Well, I think it may be something that applies more to when you're playing.
Yeah.
But it applies both to practice and playing. I mean, basically, it just refers to the fact that in all sorts of ways in golf, we're susceptible to carrying over things. You know, there's no matter how good you are, there's a natural variation during a round. Sometimes just things are going to happen. It doesn't mean necessarily that your swing is bad and so on, but you can fret for many holes about a couple missed short putts and so on. And I think the way it might apply to practice is it relates to the willingness to make mistakes. You've had dramatically more experience working with people in golf, but I've had some, and some people can just not tolerate a worse shot. That is, they've got some way of playing the game, and now you have them try a new thing and they hit a bad shot, and then they kind of are, your way doesn't work, my old way works better.
Yeah.
And that's really makes it difficult to work. I mean, because people who make progress get tuned to what the instructor's saying. The instructor is saying to do a certain thing, and then the proper feedback should be the instructor saying whether you did it or not on that swing. But people are so focused on the outcome, which in motor skills research is often called a knowledge of results, as opposed to knowledge of performance. That is, knowledge of what happened versus knowledge of what I did. That's sort of a belabored answer to a somewhat simple question, but it does get pretty complicated.
Yeah. Well, Mark, want to chime in a little bit on that one?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Tony, I don't have much to say about that because I am not much of a golfer and a beginning golfer. So, in terms of having a good backlore of knowledge to draw on with regard to instant amnesia and golf skills, I don't have much. But other than to say that I think the idea is when you're swinging the club, you're concentrating on the present moment and on the current conditions, and you're mindful. I think you should be mindful of not letting yourself fret or think back to previous shots. I think the key is focus on the present. I don't know if you've talked to Sian Bielak, who's written the book on choking, but I think she has a lot of good tips about this, about staying in the moment, focusing on the process, not worrying so much about the results.
I'm going to have to remind you after this to send me that link. I think I definitely want to read that one. I don't think I have, though. I see so many of my friends that I play with, and once in a while I do it, but, cuss and, oh, my gosh, after a shot, and it just has to carry over longer when you do that,
Yeah, one of her points is that maybe you make a bad shot, and then you start to think in cognitive in detail about exactly every little point. And I think that her point is that you get too cognitive after mistakes, and you get too analytic, and that gets in the way of what should be a smooth, routinized, almost habitual kind of action. And so the point would be amnesia is good because it allows you just to swing as you've learned to swing without any analytic, cognitive kind of guidance at the moment. So sometimes I think during practice, the idea is you want to think about those things and refine them and tune them. But once they're tuned, you want to let the system kind of automatically perform without a lot of intrusion from conscious thoughts. Isn't that right, Bob?
Yes, and golf is kind of sinister game in this, at least early on, in the sense that thinking about a certain thing, your instincts will often be to do just the wrong thing. So you're worried about out of bounds on the left, and that can lead you during the swing to make a little push out to the right, which then closes the club face, and the club face determines about 90% of where the ball goes, and now you hit it left, not right. And after a long period of practice, you can change that so that the professionals obviously can hit the ball either way intentionally, but a whole long period early when you're learning the game, if you're being sort of analytic, and then if you don't have amnesia, what can happen out there is somewhere early in the round, you might have hit some big slice way right on some shot, and now you come to a hole later in the round where there's an out of bounds on the right side, and if you don't have some sort of amnesia taking things, now your whole notion is I've got to hit this ball to the left, which leads you to pull across it, open the face, and hit it out of bounds right.
Yeah.
And so really, we get so tired of hearing in these interviews, just need to take one shot at a time. But that's really crucial. And particularly early in playing, kind of thinking back to things earlier in your round can have devastating effects.
Well, you two had a lot on that question, actually. I think you thought you didn't, but I think the people listening will really enjoy that. Can each of you talk about, say maybe one instance of some kind of a success story? I know, Mark, you may not have too much related to golf, but, obviously, Bob, you would have something related to applying some of the principles, that you guys are talking about in terms of golfers improving.
Well, I probably have too long an answer about that, so I'll try to shorten it up some. But in my own case, I kind of accidentally discovered something when I was caddying as a young kid. It wasn't appropriate to stand and watch the professional give lessons at the club where I was caddying. Mm-hmm. But I did find, as I was waiting to be assigned a bag as a caddy, that I could sit by this one tree and hear what he was saying. And then I had an odd collection of clubs, and I went back, and things like, I remember distinctly him telling you that, well, you got to hit the ball first and take the divot after. And I went back to, a vacant lot, and, well, what's that all about? And in about 2 days, I permanently got that idea in mind just by experimenting. And there are people that go their whole career, and as you know, Tony, sure, many instructions, and they're still taking the divot on the wrong side of the ball. It's another way your intuition misleads you because you think you need to lift it in the air with your swing.
Yeah.
But that really emphasized for me the importance of kind of, Hogan had expression of digging it out in the dirt, but a little bit of your own, figuring things out on your own. But as far as kind of success stories, one involving a colleague of ours, Thad Polk, who's at University of Michigan, and a couple of years ago won their faculty championship there. He started maybe 15 years ago playing in a group. We have a yearly conference called the Interdisciplinary Conference on Human Performance. And it's research papers in the morning, golf in the afternoon. So it's also called the Golf Boondoggle Conference. But he came there at the point he was, I think, a 16 handicap. And we played a couple rounds, and he just said, well, what do I need to work on before next year's meeting? I didn't even take that seriously, but I said, well, the grip needs to be here, and one other thing. When he came back the next year, he was about a 10 index, had completely incorporated those things. At the end of that time, he said, well, now what do I work on?
Oh, my gosh.
And eventually got down. I think he's about a 3 index now. But he's an example of somebody who, rather than having some notion, this is related to learning styles research that Mark and I both criticized, rather than having some notion there's kind of my way to do it, he just said, okay, how do I do these things I'm supposed to do? And then he would implant them. And that really is interesting, just to have the tenacity to say, if that's what I should do, I'm going to make myself do it. The last thing I'd mention in my own case, I had the great good fortune during a sabbatical year to spend 3 months in St. Andrews, University of St. Andrews. And that led to a lot of opportunities to play, particularly since it was getting dark at about 11 o'clock at night there, summer. And I did a few things and came back in about age, I guess I might have been 64 or something. I got my index to its lowest value ever in California, 2.7.
Wow.
And that was basically just having some time to take seriously some principles about how to practice, a few kind of things about the swing. And I think there's a great potential we all have. It's a fascination of the game. And as my example shows in my own case, the fact that we can keep playing it so long. I played on no end of football, basketball, and so on, but those things have to be given up. But golf can be really a lifelong passion. I mean, Mark's early in his career. He's a youngster playing this game.
Well, Tony, I don't know if this would resonate with other golfers, but in terms of a success story and how to do that, I knew a guy who went to Purdue. I taught at Purdue for a while. He was in the sciences, and he was a pretty good golfer, and I lost track of him, and recently saw him, and he said, oh yeah, I don't know if I told you, I won the Lafayette, Purdue's in West Lafayette. I won the Lafayette Amateur Championship. I said, well, how'd you do that? What were you doing? He said, for me, I play the best when I have one song that runs through my head, and that's just all I'm thinking about. And I think this relates to the point that if we get over-analytic and we're thinking about previous shots and ruminating over them, it can really ruin the game. And this guy, he was a very good golfer, of course, but he played the best when his mind was basically empty of previous shots and how to do things. He just had a song going through his mind, and he let his routine, habitual kind of automatic brain processes lead him through the course, and he had a great round. Had a great turn.
I think that's a great story.
It's a good example, incidentally. I meant a lot of golfers use some sort of auditory thing to incorporate the rhythm. I think, for example, some of the pros during the backswing, they say 17. Other ones say super fluid. And no end of players say Ernie Els.
Yeah.
Those things all can be mediators to keep your tempo correct. It's rumored that Tiger Woods, early in his career, would start to hum Edelweiss going down the, Edelweiss, Edelweiss. And I think those things, there's a lot of interesting research questions there that could be explored experimentally, but without having done any of that, and I don't know that other people have, I really think that sort of rhythm, kind of auditory accompaniment like that, particularly under pressure. I don't know how you'd feel about that, Tony, but under pressure, people speed up, they shorten their backswing and so on. And I think in my own case, I've found it useful right towards, I guess I've shot my age now 7 times, but I failed maybe a dozen times right near the end of a round.
Yeah.
Feeling incredible pressure, more than I ever did in other sports, to just kind of achieve this lifetime goal of shooting your age. And you need some sort of keys towards the end of that so that these almost automatic tightening up, shortening up, speeding up doesn't overtake you.
Yeah, my best golfing friend missed it by one stroke about a month or two ago, but he was still excited about it. And you probably got to get there once or twice. I think that's what you're saying too, so that you can finally do it.
I don't know how many times, if I just play the last, if I could play the last 3 holes, 1 over par, I could shoot my age. And when the moment that idea got in my mind, I was almost doomed.
Yeah.
You got to be in the situation for a while. And it's funny how people respond to different kinds of pressures. During my time in Minnesota, University of Minnesota, I was playing, tournament golf and stuff and I could play well under money pressures, but I never did play well under, if they were going to give me a $2.95 trophy if I won this little tournament, that was huge pressure. But if it was making the putt for $5, which was a whole lot of money then, I was pretty good at that. So it gets tricky how different kinds of pressure can affect different people.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, now that you're 89, you shoot easily, don't you?
Well, as one friend said, you might think about this, Mark. He says he hopes to shoot his weight.
Well, let's end with, each of you maybe just talk for a minute about what you would say, just a key point or two of advice for golfers related to some of the things we've talked about that you want to sum up. So, Bob, go first.
Well, I think if someone's willing to be sort of serious about the game and is starting, I think there are things that would save years. Uh, Things as simple as getting your hands on the club in the right way, aside from how you swing, getting your hands on and the pressure correct. If you could get that to be, there's lots of sources of what we researchers call error variance. And if you can get some things so you eliminate that, you can gain years. The basic notion that the swing comes from the inside, as people turn, the club goes to the outside, and I don't know what percentage, maybe 80%, Tony, would you say, of average golfers, their whole career, sort of cut across the ball,
it's somewhere in that. That's right.
Never come from the inside. So I think there's certain things that if you could get those stabilized, corrected right early, I think years could be saved off in terms of someone's progress. You'd have to have somebody be willing to overcome certain intuitions and stuff. But I think there is, for someone getting involved in it, there's ways to approach it that can make an incredible difference in terms of the progress. It's a very difficult game. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons that so many pro athletes in other sports become so avid and such kind of golf junkies, is they almost can't believe, given their successes in other domains, that they can't conquer this game.
Yeah. Well, Mark, you get the last word here.
Well, Tony, I've got a more general kind of thing. I don't have particular kinds of golf advice, but I think from the book Make It Stick and from my personal experience and from laboratory research, I think the tip I'd give is practice so that you're interleaving the particular things you're practicing and not massing them. I think mass practice is very seductive because you get the sense that you're improving. So I've played a lot of tennis. I've had to give it up because of my knee. I've played hockey, and I know the research, but it's even hard for me to tell myself to stop practicing the serve over and over again and move on to the forehand. I have to tell myself, stop and interleave that. Practice the serve a little bit, practice the forehand, practice the backhand. Similarly in golf, practice one iron, a couple shots, then another iron. In hockey, practice a serve move on, practice another one, move back. So I think that the literature clearly shows that leads to better retention. The learner doesn't feel comfortable because it doesn't feel like you're making progress, but in fact it's quite counter to that. So I think the big tip I'd give is to fight your intuition, fight your impulse, to keep practicing the same thing over and over till you feel it's really smooth, and keep mixing things. Mix up your practice.
I think that's a great way to end, and I really want to thank the two of you for doing this today. It was very interesting, and I think there were things, the people that get to listen to this, some of them will learn new things, and a lot of people will learn things that keep supporting the fact that they need to do things a little differently to get to play their best. So Dr. Robert Bjork and Dr. Mark McDaniel, I'll put some notes in, some web links in the show notes, but thanks to both of you again. It was a terrific interview and podcast with lots of information.
You're very welcome, and as someone who didn't co-author Make It Stick, I can say it's a terrific book.
Well, that's very good words. And Mark?
Thank you very much, Tony. And I have to say, in response, that much of the work in Make It Stick was from Bob Bjork's own research lab. So that's why it was such a good book.
So it's delightful that both of you got to do this. Thanks very much.
Taking your game to new heights. www.gameimprovementgolf.com.
Well, Mark and Robert, thanks again for this very interesting and I hope useful to our listeners podcast interview. And Robert, I got to say, you're my hero. I didn't realize you've shot your age or better a number of times, and I look forward to getting the opportunity to doing that. On the link on my website, you'll find web links to the Make It Stick book. Actually, it's Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, and also to Robert's UCLA Learning and Forgetting website. Again, thanks, guys. It was a terrific interview. Well, as I always say, that's it for today. In 2 weeks, I'll do another interview on the fundamentals of learning skills and how to apply this knowledge to golfers with Trevor Reagan, a new friend who has a wonderful website called Train Ugly. See you in 2 weeks.
Game Improvement Golf, your source of information and inspiration to become an exceptional golfer now. www.gameimprovementgolf.com